Sorry. Thank you. Hi, welcome to the sort of the first of the governance manual ad hoc committee meetings for 23. If you remember, in November at the board meeting, we were sort of constituted and given a charge to look at the governance manual, our own living document, as it were, and make changes as necessary, or recommend to the board. Recommend to the board changes as necessary for 2023. We have a couple of sort of minor ones teed up for us today. We have we have one that we're going to talk about sort of at length and tee up sort of further along as we go, and then go from there. Can I have the next slide, please, Kathy? I should say I tend to run pretty fast in these, so if people are feeling like they're not being heard or feeling that they're not having a chance to weigh in, please raise your hand, say something. I'll monitor the hand raising panel, and Kathy, if you could too, and Sydney, that would be great too, just in case I'm not sort of seeing who's there and who's weighing in. Obviously, ad hoc committee members, if you want to, you can just unmute and yell at me. So the agenda today is these 4 items. The scope that we've been given, I talked about it a little bit already. The executive director review process, we've got a couple of tweaks to that have been recommended based upon experience. Timing for chair elections, again, based upon experience, there are a couple of tweaks that I think are appropriate for the ad hoc committee to recommend to the full board for adoption. And then adding new data points, which came up in the November meeting, as you will recall, and we'll talk about today. We'll have it as a living document today as well, and work on it. And then in the next set of meetings, we'll have more fuller discussion about that and implications around that. And in that instance, it's appropriate for all of us to sort of take it back to our organizations. If you're representing an organization or a provider, it's appropriate to sort of screen it with your folks as well as we go forward. Next slide. So this is a scope. You got that in a document in the in your reading materials ahead of time. This is basically the items that were given to us in the November meeting. If you'll all remember, these are the pieces that we have for the scope. It's by no means the entire scope for what we're going to face, but for right now, these are the items for 2023. I don't know if we have that many more. And if you'll also remember our history, the living nature of the document means that we have to take a look at it periodically and give it a good clean sweep. We also have some consultants around who are giving us advice around the work as well. Some of them are observing us today, and they've been engaged to help us in sort of our board processes we have going forward. Next.
Actually, you've got your hand up from Chris.
Oh, sorry, Chris. There you are. You're muted. Can we unmute Chris?
All right, there we go. Sorry, I couldn't.
Sorry,
unmute.
I was trying to do it. I'm sorry.
No, I just had a quick process question.
Yeah.
About the data set expansion document.
Yeah.
And I saw that Mary Ann circulated some revisions to it just before the meeting yesterday.
Correct.
Does that mean that I missed my opportunity to provide feedback and I should have done that before the meeting, or is that from this point forward that we're providing feedback?
No, I think from this point forward, we're providing feedback. I think they have our wonderful team has the opportunity as they're thinking about things to revise and put them in front of us. And I think that was an effort for them to get some stuff in front of us that they wanted to.
Okay.
It is now, we now start our process for sort of review, having our folks recycle, review, and do that kind of stuff. And I think we're going to have it in front of us for one or more meetings going forward.
All right, thank you.
No worries. Other hands? So this is the scope process. Can we go to the next item? To my point earlier, to your question, Chris, here's the timing. We've got today to discuss the data points piece and a couple of other sort of pieces as well. We're going to cycle out draft language. The team's going to cycle out draft language of that, and for us to do some interaction too. We have another meeting scheduled for January 11th. Then on January 19th, we have an additional meeting to discuss edits and changes in data points. And then our obligation is to send the final to the board for consideration by the end of January. So you can see multiple touch points, multiple opportunities for editing and consulting, especially within your own organizations. Any questions on that one? All right, moving forward. So let's take a look at the executive director review process piece. And Kathy, if I could see the slide on suggested edits. This came about as a result of some interplay and a little bit of lack of clarity in terms of who we're going to find to do the 360 process around the executive director review process. And I think it was sort of one of those things we learned as we went and needed to get some better clarity on that. And so that one's in front of us, and I just want to lay it out for folks. If anybody have any questions about that or see any concerns in those suggested edits. Fabulous. Well, I didn't mention earlier, but we're actually going to not take votes as an ad hoc here today, but we will going forward. And so unless we have any questions, we're going to sort of move this one forward as an approved item, or as an item that we did not change into our decision phase. Next. Oh, and because of this, because it's an item that it will be a decision point that goes to the board, at some point we will need to do a public comment opening too. So Mara, can you do the public comment and see if there's any sort of commentary on that item?
I have not received any public comment.
Great. Any issues, any other hands, folks? I'm scanning, I'm not seeing. Okay, with that, I will close the public comment opportunity and we'll go on to the next one, board chair elections. This came up too because we had a little bit of, we had sort of some phasing issues, I think, last year in terms of the board elections process, both with legislative and governors and organizations appointing folks and having folks be in place for there to be a known pool from which to pull and a known pool of those who will be voting in the board chair election. So out of that confusion and with some suggestions and some consultation with the team, they're recommending these edits, that we do the governing board share conversation at the first meeting of the fiscal year, and that the election that it happen immediately upon the individual seated will take place immediately upon election. Again, another one of those sort of cleanups in operation. It'll make us more efficient in the work that we're doing, and I think that the team will appreciate that clarity piece as well. Any questions on this one from board members, ad hoc committee members? Scanning. All your lovely faces on a Friday afternoon. All right, I do not see any discussion on this one. Mari, again, can we open it up for public comment to see if anybody has any public comments or concerns about this item itself?
Yeah, again, I haven't gotten anything.
Great. Thank you. Again, this one will move forward without comment to our decision-making round as we go. Next slide, please, Kath. Adding new data points. Obviously, I think we're going to spend a bunch of time on this today. We're going to do a little bit of live editing of the document as well. Wanted to give a little bit of background on how it came about and how we came to the place, if you recall, in November of deciding that this is when we got to get off. We have to get on because of sort of early deliverables for the board and sort of decision-making by the board in November that it come to this, that it come to our ad hoc committee meeting. So the legislation itself speaks to providers adding the data points in it. If you go to the next one, Kathy, there we go. And that we're responsible as a board for expanding that data set as we go. And we had a lot of conversation, folks will remember, in our planning process around additional data providers themselves. But then, and we had less conversation, but it was as significant about data points and sort of adding data points as we went going forward in processes. And we had the first example come up with the teacher database that we're trying to have as one of our first deliverables, and some of the data points that are required in that space. And so, can you go on to the next one, please? Thank you, Kathy. The participation agreements that you all signed also anticipated this activity as well. It's pretty clear in that participation agreement that we can add data points with your permission and with providers' permission, I should say, and others going forward through a process that we don't have to reopen all of those participation agreements again to go forward with it. And so that's part of the reason that this group was chosen to be the ones to sort of figure out our process for adding those new data points. Next slide, please. Our governance manual also speaks. The current governance manual also speaks to the issue too, because there are opportunities for data point suggestions to come into the organization from advisory boards and others. And by design, we always meant for there to be an opportunity for those outside the group, as it were, to have input into what we collect and how we collect. Obviously, the sort of the baseline is of course, if a provider can't or won't or is not able to, we have to figure that process out as well. And that's the process that we're working on today. Next. So
Actually,
Sorry.
Gavin,
Yeah.
I think that our board chair, Robert Tagordo, had a statement he was going to make on this, just to relate it back to.
Oh, sorry, if I missed a hand. Sorry, Robert.
Yeah.
No problem. So this obviously speaks to the governance manual, which talks about operational roles for the Data and Tools Advisory Board, the governing board, and the offices you could see laid out here on this slide. And then before we look at the specific language, I think it's important to clarify some key principles in the proposal. First, that and there are about 5 or 6 points I think that I kind of want to highlight here. One is that data providers will be closely involved in any recommendation about data points and have the ultimate say over what data they contribute to C2C. The second, the proposal clarifies what happens when a data provider seeks to include additional data points in the P20W analytical data set. So for example, if the Teacher Credentialing Commission wanted to add information on a new preschool certification in the future, this detail is provided so that a consistent process is followed that ensures the board members and the public are aware of new data points that are available for dashboards, the query builder, or research requests. Third point, the Data and Tools Advisory Board has the ability to suggest additional data points, but any suggestion must go through a feasibility study by the office in close consultation with the relevant data providers. This is obviously to ensure that we abide by the principles that C2C provides high quality data in alignment with our collective goals and prevent undue burden to share that information. Fourth point, the Advisory Board Governance Ad Hoc Committee will be developing language about how proposals get surfaced and prioritized, which this ad hoc committee will review next month. But regardless of the specific language they suggest, the process would entail multiple steps. Ideas must be agreed to by the advisory board before they're forwarded from the advisory board to the office for a feasibility study. And the advisory board must agree to forward the proposal to the governing board after hearing about the feasibility study. Whatever the vote of the governing board about that recommendation, the data provider still has final say about whether it provides the data point. A couple more before I yield to the group. The proposal distinguishes between data points that are already collected by state agencies. For example, in the case of the teacher dashboard, the type of job an educator holds at a local educational agency versus something that is not yet collected by a state agency. So as a theoretical, how many children an individual has, for example. If the proposal would require that local providers such as school districts or social service providers report additional data to the state, then those local providers must also be consulted as part of the feasibility study. And then lastly, at the point that the data point has been approved and defined by the relevant data providers, it'll be added to the definitions page on the C2C website for transparency and for ensuring that everyone has access to that product.
Great. Thank you, Robert. This pictorial and the wording was put together by our very own Ryan Estrellado, and I would like to give him the floor to talk about it a little bit too, and sort of walk it through with us if folks are okay with that.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Gavin. I think what I prefer to do, if it's okay, is just see if there's any clarifications from needed from the ad hoc committee members.
So I see two hands up. I see Jerry's hand raised and then Christopher Joeli. So
Go for it. Jerry, you first. Thanks, Ed.
no problem. Oh, he may be having trouble unmuting.
I just had a quick question about the participation agreement that was signed. That participation agreement is between the managing entity and the providers, correct? I'm trying to understand the governing board's role when it comes to that participation agreement.
I'm a little unclear on the question. Can you say it another way? There you go. I think you're unmuted.
My unmuting was giving me some trouble there. I guess I'm just trying to understand our role as the governing board and what we're recommending in this governance manual, which are basically the rules in the governing board's operation, and how that participation agreement fits in here, how new data elements fit into the participation agreement between the managing entity and the data providers, and the specific role that the governing board itself has in, I mean, are we just there to rubber stamp or approve new data elements if and when they come up? And how would that affect the participation agreement? I mean, there would have to be some sort of new understand MOU, something between the providers and the managing entity, or am I off base on that one?
Right. I think with the providers, with a provider's permission, a new element can be added into the issue. As to the board's role in that, our role is to both take suggestions from our own advisory boards and others, and take suggestions generated internally and make them make them plain to the staff, to the team, to the managing entity, to put into the system as we, the board, are in charge of making sure the system's delivering on the schools. That makes sense? Chris, let's go to you in case Jerry, Jerry, if you want to have a follow-up. I'm missing you on my screen. No? Okay, good. Chris?
Hi,
There you go.
yeah. A couple of things. I saw in an earlier slide, we were linking to the section in the participation agreement, and I think it was 6.115. I personally think 6.113 is the more appropriate section of the participation agreement that says that as required by FERPA, that the data providers retain sole control and may reject, add, or remove data elements from the P20 data set. I think that's the guiding language for everything we're talking about here. It's mentioned several times in here that the data providers have the ultimate authority of whether they provide something or not. But I think 6.113 is the more appropriate language in the participation agreement for that. The second thing is on the graphic you have here for the three different scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
The one on the left, I understand how, there, in some cases, data providers may suggest adding new data points, and we need to have a process for that. But the other two, I don't understand the distinction between an existing data point and a new data point. And how does the Data and Tools Advisory Board know the difference between something that's existing and something that's new with respect to what data providers have? Because I would think that would be something that the feasibility study would determine is this data point that they've requested, is it existing or is it new? That's like step one of the feasibility study. So I only see two scenarios here and not one.
Interesting. Interesting point. My assumption, and this is sort of my own personal assumption, is that the Data and Tools Advisory Board would have knowledge of whether it's an existing collected point or it's a sort of a new collection. And so that's what my interpretation of that was, but let's get some clarification on that. Marianne?
Sure. Thank you, Chris. I think that what this visual, again, this is a starting point that we put together to try to provide structure for the conversation. So it's ultimately up to you all what you think makes sense. What we're trying to show visually is that if by existing data point, that means it's already collected and validated by a state level entity. A new data point would mean that it is not yet, is to add an extra step that brings to the table any entities for whom that would create, a burden or require additional resources or something like that, to try to create a part of the process that explicitly acknowledges that this is a different ask, if you will, of saying, we're already collecting and validating a data point that may require a different level of feasibility study and engagement with different entities than if it would require something that's not yet being collected and validated. And showing that visually, that extra box might help advisory board members or community members providing input and thinking about the system recognize the distinction between the two. So that's why we hadn't just collapsed those into one and had tried to represent that extra step there. So that was the intent.
Thank you for that. And the reason why it grabbed my attention is because I remember in a previous board meeting when we were selecting the panels for the various advisory boards, the priority that we landed on for at least the first round of advisory boards was that we wanted to minimize the number of spots on the advisory boards that had governing board seats. So there was like this sort of built-in mechanism to where data providers would not be as represented on the advisory boards. And that was a conscious decision we made because we wanted to create opportunities for other members on the advisory board. So there's a built-in mechanism for knowledge of what data providers have or don't have to not be present on the advisory boards. So I would think it would be difficult for the advisory boards to know what is an existing or not, or a new data point.
That's right. Though, we'll do our best to try to facilitate as much clarity on those points as possible. But I think, the additional box here follows the feasibility study. So in some sense, that process would ensure if we do a feasibility study, it would be in partnership with the relevant data providers and ensure that at that stage, all the relevant information is there. Does that make sense? So to some extent, we can make sure something ends up in the right path.
I would just, my preference, and this is just a suggestion here, is that the feasibility study decide whether it's a existing or a new data point, and that those two things suggest completely different criteria. Like it just sort of, it's like a flow chart, whereas like, is this existing or not? Yes, no. If yes, go in this direction, and here's the criteria. If no, then it's a different set of criteria. But it seems like that would be the purview of a feasibility study and not for the advisory board to try to make a guess on whether it's new or existing.
Okay. So that would suggest combining the top and then having a split after the feasibility study that has two separate processes.
Good points, interesting points. Thank you. Other comments on this slide before we get into the live build?
Gavin, just a clarifying question here. This slide and the visual isn't intended to replace the more detailed written text that we received, right?
Certainly not.
Okay.
Would that we could do everything with pictures, but no. All right. Shall we go on then, Kathy, to the live build piece?
Yes, my apologies. I had a little computer error here, so it's going to take me a second to get back to the right screen. Just a moment.
No worries. I wish I had hold music.
My apologies. It just completely crashed on me, and I'm having a moment in getting it up. Here we go. Share screen.
There it is.
Can you see that? And can I maybe make this a little bit bigger so folks can see it? I have this problem sometimes where it makes the wrong thing bigger. There we go. All right, and for clarification for folks that are following from the field who are looking at what was posted up on the website, this new green text is what is different from what you saw before and reflects some preliminary feedback from some of the ad hoc committee members. So again, is your preference just to have us scroll through the document and have—
I think that's exactly right. So let's open it for folks who might have suggestions to the drafting of the language. Sort of noting, of course, that this won't be the only suggestion too. You can bring those into the next meetings that we have as well. But in terms of how you're reacting to this, ad hoc committee members, it would be great to get thoughts on paper now so that we can then digest and go forward with folks. And so any ad hoc committee member folks who want to make comment, please feel free.
Do you want me to just scroll and have us review?
Sure.
I guess one at a time.
Sure, go for it.
Okay. So I guess just anything in that new green text, maybe for starters.
I'm going to say silence is assent, but I know that'll not be a good thing. Let's move on. Let's do scenario one and sort of let people walk through the text per Meredith's comment earlier.
Hi, everybody, Ryan here. I think Chris has got his hands up.
Go for it.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. The green text is where I was thinking, I mean, I like this addition to it, but here I was hoping we could somehow weave in language from 6.113 from the participation agreement. That, you know, data providers may reject that or remove data elements contributed to it. I think that's basically what the darker green statement is saying, but if we could figure out a way to tie it more explicitly to that section, I think it would be helpful.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. I'm scanning. Okay, we'll go back to scenario one, if we could, please.
Just a framing comment that became more obvious when seeing the diagram. Originally, when I read this text, I thought of scenario 1, 2, and 3 as just illustrative examples, but not all encompassing. And seeing sort of this diagram makes it a little bit more clear that, what if as a stakeholder, a group or individual doesn't feel that they fall into one of those top buckets, what happens? So both for the preamble before we launch into scenarios and for any engagement or communication around diagrams, I would stress that, you know, who might not be in a given scenario question.
So to clarify that, do I hear you say that sort of suggestions from folks not inside the process we need to have a sort of a clearer way for folks outside to be able to have a say and have a way to get a suggestion into the process?
Yeah, I think it's implicit, given my knowledge of, you know, setting up the advisory board and so forth, that there is a mechanism, but from an operational standpoint, just underscoring, do we have the capacity and how clear is that mechanism for a member of the general public to chime into that advisory board mechanism or the data provider mechanisms?
Got it. I think in most instances, right, but I'm probably presuming a level of sophistication that I shouldn't presume, but in most cases the office could probably guide them in the right way to sort of get input into the process. But the more clarity that we can put on paper that are part of our public documents, I think is a great idea. Thank you.
Would we want to add text that essentially says that ideas for additional data points may only be raised through the Data and Tools Advisory Board, therefore that members of the public would reach out to an advisory board member to suggest a data point? Is that what you were thinking, Meredith?
I wouldn't presume whether the individual data providers have or don't have mechanisms to collect public input. So I guess it's more of just breadcrumbs or a roadmap to direct people who don't already identify as having input into either of those first boxes.
My suspicion would be that the first place that someone would go who's not familiar with the process would be Marianne and the team. So it might be appropriate to sort of list them as the first screen.
I would agree with Gavin's recommendation, something to that effect, so that the presumption there would be that the office can help direct whatever that scenario might be to the appropriate place.
That would appear to then actually would scenario 1 would be the mechanism for data providers. And then I guess we'd have this clause about scenarios 2 and 3 as having a preamble that's what the Data and Tools Advisory Board does. Is that correct? Okay, so and then we would just remove this in essence. Oops. Just do a cross out. And then we would just go into this description. Would that be appropriate?
Wouldn't that fit under scenario 2?
Right now, this is for data providers wanting to put things in, because the 2 and 3 are both for ideas that are generated out of the Data and Tools Advisory Board, as I understood the write-up.
Yeah, sorry, I was still on the members of the public.
Yeah, I grabbed that text out, but yes. So I guess scenario 1 is members of the public, scenario 2 is data providers, and scenario 3 is that, like, I shouldn't use those terms because they were used before. We've got 3 starting points: member of the public, data provider, and Data and Tools Advisory Board. Is that the appropriate way for this to be structured in this document?
Kathy, one way that we might think about this, and this is not necessarily a suggestion, just something to throw out to the group, is maintain the scenarios that we had in place, and then effectively have a line in there that says, if not captured by the scenarios, then the process would be for consultation with the office so that they can be directed to the appropriate place. In other words, if I'm capturing what Meredith was trying to communicate, which I agree with, we want to provide an outlet for scenarios that were not covered by the explicit examples that we have in the current draft.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like Robert's suggestion. The thing that was confusing me, Kathy, was at least the version of the document that I was looking at. Scenario 3 was a data provider or an advisory board requests data that is like a new collection process, and that it seems like if the request involves something, to Chris's earlier point, that requires a lot of startup, and it's not something that would be as easily done from a technical perspective from what already exists. Maybe that's sort of a box versus a different scenario, because the who in that scenario falls into both scenario 1 and scenario 2.
Okay, so now I put it back. So we start with scenario 1. Does the wording here fit? Like, does it make sense? Are there edits that need to be made to the scenario 1?
I had a question just generally about scenario 1. What sets it apart from the other scenarios or scenario wherever we land is the Data and Tools Advisory Board is a formal public process of, you know, how a proposal is going to be put together for new data elements. This one is a little bit more ambiguous about how it comes together. You know, there's communication between the office and data providers. I think it even says via email. So I worry about transparency of that process, and how do we make that more transparent, the whole evolution of that conversation. And then also, since we're talking about, you know, sort of public access into this process, how if somebody for whatever reason is better positioned to enter or, access this process through a data provider, it's less clear how to do that if it's being done through informal channels like email and communication. So how could we make a more formal mechanism for a more formal and transparent mechanism that's on par with an advisory board meeting like's happening with the other scenario?
Mm.
It looks like Marianne has her hand raised.
Go ahead.
If I could ask a clarifying question for Chris. So, Chris, I think what I'm hearing you say is that you see a value in public participation or transparency at the earlier stages of scenario one, or later in the process, bringing it to the board to kind of formalize as this is now a data point that will be considered part of the P20W data set, and the office should update, a table on the website that makes it clear that this is a consistently, transferred data point so that people know what's in the data set. And so there would be transparency at that stage of saying, here's what's being added and why. Is what you're getting at that you would like more transparency at an earlier stage before it comes to the board in a public meeting for that discussion, or how? Well, it's really just the language of number one there. Data provider in the office explore an additional data point. And then I think it mentioned something about communicating over email as the mechanism for how it happens somewhere. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Confirm, agree, changes via email. It doesn't seem to be as transparent and formal a public process for a new data element proposal coming together as it does in the other scenario where there's a public body that's meeting and there's public participation and comment into the whole thing. It seems less transparent and formal.
Chris, in case it's helpful, when I read that specificity of email, I interpreted that as in writing before there would be a more formal discussion, like public comment and so forth, further down the line. Yeah, but I also have line by line suggestions. Yeah. I don't know, Kathy, if you want to, Kathy and Gavin, if we want to go through that now or.
Certainly.
Okay, I've got my list. So the number 2, it says the director of data programs. While I appreciate that there's this very specific owner and a role there, I wonder if just putting or designated alternate or alternates would give you flexibility in case the director of data programs is not available.
Okay.
If nobody else has anything on this page, I have something for number 3.
No, and I don't want to let go of Chris's point. I'm not quite sure how to draft it, but I hear it, and I'm sure Kathy and Marianne are thinking about it too.
I think Meredith's point is helpful about the public vetting that's happening subsequent to all this would certainly provide transparency. It's just, I'm thinking about this from sort of personal experience as a data provider and not really knowing that there were conversations happening about additional data elements being potentially suggested by data providers until very recently. And I realized we didn't really anticipate that. And that's kind of why we're having this conversation now. But it sort of caught me off guard that was a possibility and that could happen. And I don't even, it's not necessarily a a problem. It's just the Data and Tools Advisory Board is a bit more predictable. There's a schedule of meetings when things are going to happen. It's something you could sort of set your clock to of when these things might happen. But the other one seems a little bit more unpredictable. But I agree with Meredith. I think the subsequent deliberations in public that happen via the board are probably sufficient.
Yeah, I agree with you. All right, Meredith, thank you. Go ahead, continue, please.
Okay, and this is actually connected to the meta theme that is being raised. Isn't there a really important comma needed here for the data provider, comma, governing board member? You were there. And the executive director. There's 3 entities here,
Yes,
right?
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay, and so once they agree, these are still requested changes, right? They're agreeing on the requested changes for number 3.
Correct.
So I think that word requested is pretty critical at this point. And it's still requested in step 4.
Yeah,
and that's where it's
4A.
going
Yep, great,
to
thank you. Very good clarity.
that more public discussion.
Yep.
And to my understanding, as I read this through, the data points aren't shared yet because this is still in a request phase. And so I think for part B, it would be about newly available data points versus newly shared data points. Is that right for the staff, that there's still a research request process? And so this sort of more informal, these are available bucket of 4B are not actually part of the official P20W set, right?
Yes, if I'm understanding your question correctly, that's right. So what we were trying to navigate in the starting point language is that the participation agreement is clear that any data provider can choose to share data points above and beyond what is in that appendix if they. Oh, am I unmuted again?
Yep,
any data provider can share data points above and beyond because they would like us, to manage requests for that or whatever the reason is. So there's, what's in the participation agreement is a floor, if you will, not a ceiling. So any data provider could share those data, but the A versus B here is trying to distinguish between, data points that are then formally a part of the P20W data set that people can expect to see on an ongoing basis, including, as you mentioned, for the research request process, which we facilitate, but do not decide, right? Because the data providers continue to own that decision-making process. When researchers request access to data through our processes, we facilitate that application process and bring it to the relevant data providers who then take a decision on a case-by-case basis.
That might be worth in any public document, Marianne, a footnote or like FAQ in terms of the research request process.
That's a great suggestion. I think that's right.
In 4A, do we want to remove the word required data point from there as well?
And then for step 5, it was unclear to me in reading this description whether those optional, sort of the ceiling, if you will, data points that you just described are part of the updated list that is circulated and posted. Is the office going to, sort of do that if there's capacity or always?
I suppose part of that is a question for this group, but I think from the office's perspective, we would like to be as transparent as possible with the public about what data points are available for the research request process. This would also include if there are new data points that are decided to be added for a particular dashboard, right? So people understand the available ingredient list, if you will, for what they could request through the process.
So if it's any comfort, the way I read this was exactly what you meant, Meredith. It's sort of all and everything.
Okay, then my only sort of comment, thinking multiple chess moves ahead, is that reading the language, there are mechanisms for if usage, changes, or there are unforeseen circumstances or concerns, there are mechanisms for removing things that were added, I guess whether or not they're part of the formal or informal available data. And so just having version control and the right capacity to communicate what is current, what maybe was added temporarily and then changed again, that takes some planning to do well and to keep people updated. So I would just encourage us to set a cadence or expectations conservatively so that you can meet or exceed expectations.
Absolutely. Great suggestion. So that's scenario one. Does anybody have any other comments about scenario one? I'm scanning for hands, but you can also just talk. All right, let's move on to number two.
So shall I proactively edit this to just say that the advisory board is requesting a data point, period,
Yeah.
and then we
Yeah.
make that addition to the splitting process for the feasibility study? Okay.
Yeah. Agreed.
Okay, how's that for clarification about that extra step?
Looks good to me.
Is this part of the feasibility study, this language, or is it?
Does that answer it, Chris, that we've made clear that it's part of the feasibility study instead of the second phase of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, one other thing, the bullets there above for the feasibility study. Does legal requirements encompass like privacy considerations?
My assumption is yes, but let's put it in.
Kathy, if I may, I believe there may be one extra bullet point that you'll want to cut and paste up with the, I think you had something about, oh, maybe this was only in the visual, but something about burden or costs or resources needed for the entities who would be submitting a new data point to the data providers. There was a less wordy way that we had it in the slide version. If we want to highlight that in the bullet points.
Okay.
Or maybe it's fine to have this whole separate bullet point. I'll leave that.
I think I might have, yes. can you see the slide deck up on the screen right now?
Yep.
Okay, all right, so goodness, I made that very small. It says input on data collection approaches. So I don't see anything that's more, I think maybe it was well explained by by Robert, and that's what you're remembering. So let's go back to this and show me what it is that would be better to improve in this wording.
I think it's fine. I think my mind just thought it would feel missing from the sub bullet points, but it's better to have it out as its own separate and thorough bullet point. So I rescind my comment.
And then
I
one
think that's right.
other
Go
one
ahead.
other thing up. We're talking about the contents of the feasibility study essentially.
Mhm.
Is the end product of a feasibility study a yes or a no from the data provider? Like, yes, we can, or no, we can't? Or is it just, here's a whole bunch of information on data availability, legal requirements, costs, politics, and there's no clear indication either way from the data provider if they can do it?
So that's a great question. My assumption was that our job as the office would be to put together a feasibility study that lays out this information, but that it's not our role in our part of the feasibility study to make a recommendation for either yes or no. And that would be a separate step, right? It's like, here's the feasibility study and all the information that we as an office were able to get in collaboration with data providers who we asked to make sure that we're doing this as informed as possible. But that it would be helpful to separate that information from a data provider's then decision of whether, given the information, the feasibility study and their own needs and feasibility assessments, what their response to that would be, and to think of those as two separate things that are informed by each other. But I was not imagining that the feasibility study our office concludes would have a recommendation of yes or no, but would
not so much a recommendation, but going back to the participation agreement, like if the data providers have final say, when does that final say on feasibility essentially? Yes, it's feasible. No, it's not feasible. When does that happen?
Defer to others' thoughts. I would imagine that would come after the feasibility study. But
Right. My assumption is a feasibility study feeds into a decision about yes or no that it is made by the board, the office, and the provider itself.
Would you like to include an item that's like the opinion of the data provider expressly as a part of the report?
It seems like that's missing here. I don't see it anywhere. I see a lot of information related to feasibility being collected and presented to the advisory board and then potentially to the governing board. But I don't see a place in here where there's ever a final opinion from the data provider on whether, yes, it's feasible, no, it's not feasible. I don't know when the right place for that to happen is, but that's sort of one of the cornerstones of the participation agreement.
So I think what do you think about the bullet that Kathy just added?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially, I mean, I would prefer to see it at the end, I guess, like with all the supporting data on feasibility, we think, yeah, our conclusion, I don't know if, is yes, it's feasible. Fine, feasibility determination, yes or no.
Okay.
Does that capture what you're thinking, Chris?
Yeah. And, I'm interested in others' opinion on this, if they think this is a missing piece of the process or if I'm misunderstanding, because I didn't see it anywhere in there.
My own belief is that the sort of conclusions or stances are really absolutely appropriate to put into this conversation at this point. So I'm sort of trying to walk through scenarios.
I would agree too, Chris, and I'd struggle with where to put it.
Yeah.
I think this is the feasibility study location, I think, is the right place to put it.
When I read this the first time, I saw at least an implicit framing of the alignment in mission and priorities and availability of resources, not only for Cradle-to-Career, but the data provider. And maybe that's something that doesn't necessarily have to go in the manual, but should be kept top of mind when actually negotiating positive change where you need to have that alignment.
I believe for the advisory board governance process, there's a discussion of how that information could be shared as something that would be part of them preparing to bring recommendations forward. I think we're still working on that. That language will be discussed in a week from now. Oh, Gavin, it looks like Marianne has her hand raised.
Marianne.
Going back to the question that I think it was Chris was raising a moment ago about kind of the data provider's view on that. I think one thing that we may not need to include it here in this language, but I'm just imagining the process of signing off on a document and being ready to release and discuss it. There may be some benefit to just having a very clear section if it's part of the same piece of, here's the office's work, here's the process the office used, here's how we collaborated to gather this different information, here's kind of the overall big picture, and then have a separate section that kind of comes directly from the data providers on, here's our determination given this information, and here's the data provider's view. I'm just thinking those are kind of two different authors, if you will. I'm imagining literally the Word document as we write it. And it may be helpful to be clear about who's the author of this section. And there's a separate section that's like, here's the data provider's reflection and determination. Because especially if there are multiple data providers, it may be quite challenging as the office to encompass all of that together in one cohesive feasibility study. So maybe one way to think about this is, the office does a feasibility study. We do that to the best of our ability, try to pull together all the relevant information. And then any affected data provider also has and here's our view, so that it's clear who the author is. And maybe that gets to your point, Chris, as you're asking these questions. I'm realizing that if we really want to ensure that we're clear about the fact that the data provider is the ultimate decider, we want to have that, be clear in the document we're discussing as well. So that was a long-winded way of saying either have it be separate and say, here's the feasibility study, now here's a determination from the data providers, or just have it as clear sections within the same thing so that there's clarity.
Yeah, I like that.
I love that suggestion. Yeah,
I really like that idea, especially because it incentivizes the data providers to have their own sort of internal vetting process for really doing their own feasibility study, as it were, of whether they can provide this or not, and to generate a conclusion from that.
Yeah, great suggestion. Okay. Anybody, Meredith, do you have other line items or line edits for any other really important comments to add to places where we've missed them?
I assume there will be propagation of things where there were repeats.
Okay.
So I front loaded. I guess one flag for scenario, are we still on scenario 2? Was
Yeah.
there was that bullet about the vote? Where did that go? It said that the governing board would vote. And then there was a second sentence that said if all affected data providers agree, then the data point is approved. And so back to Jerry's point, why are we bothering to vote if that second sentence sort of implied that there wasn't a discussion or whatnot? I'm not sure where it went.
Oh, it's right there.
Okay.
And you're right. It should be, I'm thinking there should be a vote by the governing board to formalize the activity.
Did I capture that correctly?
I think so. It's hard to see without scenario 1 and 2 next to each other, but there was just one of the sections had a vote and the other one didn't. Or
I think that, yeah, that is a difference in nuance. This was sort of presuming that the data provider decides. So community college's chancellor's office changes the way that it's calculating completion of transfer level math and just says, by the way, we're now giving you CB25 instead of CB21 kind of thing, or something like that. So does this, should there be a vote? Because I guess you're saying here, they do formally vote to include the list. So that is, there's a vote in this one.
Yep.
Is that appropriate to have the vote here and not here? Or is it that you want to say that here that they discuss and formally votes to make it parallel in construction with the other one?
Okay.
I think that's fine. It was actually scenario 2, where it said that the governing board discusses the recommendation from the advisory board. And yeah, now you've added some sort of a vote.
Yep.
I have a question about the preceding bullet here about study results discussed at the Data and Tools Advisory Board with the members of the data providers present. Does that mean with data provider representatives who have membership on the board, or are they invited to speak to it if there are no members from the data provider on the board?
I can try to answer that. I think the default would be, the Data and Tools Advisory Board is primarily composed of members of the public. So the idea would be that the Data and Tools Advisory Board would have the opportunity to invite technical experts. It wouldn't need to, when you said members of the board, it wouldn't need to be the governing board member for that data provider. It could be, whatever technical expert from the data provider is best positioned to answer questions around the feasibility or, what's possible, what isn't possible. I think the spirit of this bullet, as I understand it, is to try to give the Data and Tools Advisory Board every opportunity to bring well-informed recommendations to the governing board. So that's why that was there. So they have an opportunity to say, at this advisory board meeting, we'd like to just bring in representatives from the following data providers who, would be involved in this recommendation we're considering.
Yeah. So it would be experts invited from the data provider to speak to it.
That's great clarification. Thank you.
Do you want to modify here to say that they're expert representatives, or is it okay to have this final clause to serve as expert advisors?
That's fine, I think. Just because the way I read it was that it was representatives who also happen to be members of Data and Tools Advisory and are present at the meeting, is how I read it.
Maybe we make it more active and say the office and representatives, let me just pull that, representatives from the data providers. Oh, good Lord, if I can type correctly. Present the feasibility study results.
Great.
To the Data and Tools Advisory Board.
Great idea. Nice clarification.
Just put a little active voice in there.
All right, looking for hands. Anything else on scenario 2? Assuming, of course, that the ever competent Kathy will sort of make our language concordant up and down. Okay, seeing no hands, no one waving their hands, we'll go on to number 3.
I think that we actually, it's no longer necessary
I
because
think that's right.
yeah,
We've
but
just
it's
merged the main point into scenario 2. Yep.
and then we've got scenario 3. How does this sound?
Looks good to me.
Maybe it should be board or agency.
Yep. So the only codicil that I'd add to that though too is that if they're suggesting a data point, what's the question that and I may be getting too narrow on this, but what's the question they're seeking to answer? And perhaps there's another way to had it answered without that data point. But we don't need to put that in the manual. It's probably operational procedure by the office.
And maybe we take out the person and just make it board or agency.
I think person's fine.
If I may, perhaps just adding the word process would clarify that, because it may not be that we need to point them to an individual, a board, or an agency, but rather say, actually this query builder will help you out, or here's a resource another one of the data providers already has online, or something like that.
Oh, lovely, perfect.
That's not really a process. Maybe resource.
Resource, yep. Great.
And that's the end of that section.
That's the end of that section. Any other last comments on this one before we sort of do another round of sort of discussion and talking amongst ourselves?
I think you can end the sentence after resource. Boards and agencies can also serve as resources, just for simplification.
Love that efficiency.
Is there a specific, this is probably too much detail, but email address at c2c.ca.gov, contact this, and they'll direct you to the appropriate resource?
The info at sounds like a great option for now. We may have more refined processes in the future, which we can update this time.
Yeah. This will be good too, because many of us will probably get these shots across the bow and we'll want to know where to send them to.
Yeah, exactly.
Marvelous. Any other comments on this document? Going once, twice, and good. I think we're good for now.
I thought you were going to do 3 times, Gavin. I have
I know.
on my list.
I was going to.
I did my homework for you.
Well, we only have 2 scenarios now, so
I know.
Oh,
somewhere down the line in 2023, the legitimate public purpose clause and what that means in practice, I would just encourage us to find existing language to point to on what that means so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel with, various wordsmithing on what constitutes a legitimate public purpose.
That's a great idea. I'm just trying to, I don't know if there is such a thing.
In the manual somewhere it says vetting for legitimate public
No, I know, I get it.
purpose.
I get it. I'm just trying to recall if there's sort of a standard legitimate public purpose checklist. Fascinating. Yep. Now I gotta go
In the
look for one.
absence of it, pointing to a couple concrete examples and
Totally
dashboards
agree.
as illustrative examples, but it's a question that's hard to answer, and to the extent that there's language from the state that we could point to.
Yep. Point taken. Okay. I think we have come to the public comment section, and I think by timing we're pretty close there too. So let's go ahead. If you could, am I open enough for public comment, and we will go from there.
Yes, we have one from Bruce, and let me unmute.
Great.
Hi, thank you, everyone. This is Bruce Yanahiro. I'm making a public comment, although I am also a lawyer for the Department of Education, but I just wanted to provide a little feedback, maybe to save you some unwasted time and effort. But a few things to consider. I have 3 points. First is whether to develop this process as a policy or a best practice, as opposed to an amendment to the governance manual. And I think there's some pros and cons to the different approaches. We don't have time to talk about it here, but something to consider. Second, this idea, the whole purpose of Cradle-to-Career was to combine agency databases and provide additional information to create this longitudinal database, and to create dashboards and tools, not to provide the underlying data elements. So the question shouldn't be about what data element should we add, but we should really be asking the public, what tools, what dashboards, what visualizations combining agency data would be useful. And then let the Data and Tools Advisory Board figure out the way to create those dashboards, tools, and visualizations, and what underlying data is really best to accomplish that. Because the data themselves can be very complex. I know, at least with the CDE data, it doesn't always mean what people think it means. And so I want to make that point and maybe change the conversation a little bit about adding data points, changing that to adding tools, visualizations, dashboards, and the like. And with respect to researchers, they can come directly to the participating agencies and get any data that they collect. So it doesn't need to be through C2C, although sometimes it's easier to facilitate that way. And then the final point is this idea about adding new data elements that aren't already collected by state agencies. I think that's going to be legally prohibited. State agencies, the Information Practices Act prevents state agencies from collecting or maintaining any data that it doesn't need to perform its own statutory duties. So this idea that you could ask it from locals and then ask a state agency to go collect it and deliver it is not workable. So I don't know how that would actually happen. I think the privacy laws would prohibit it, and it's going to make it extremely complex. If you want to pursue that, you should probably get an attorney general opinion to see if you can even do it. So those are the comments I can add.
Thank you, Bruce. Speaking to your second comment, I agree with you. My assumption throughout has been there will be an iterative process in all of our advisory committees and in board conversations too, as well as sort of in your own agencies, as to what are the questions that do need to be answered. What are we trying to see? What's the knowledge that we're trying to seek? And that those conversations themselves, like the conversation we're having about the teacher dashboard that sort of sparked this conversation about data points, was a question that we wanted to answer as one of our first sort of outward facing activities. And so my assumption is that your second point is built into what we're trying to get at here, but I think we should always remind ourselves of the notion of what are we trying to answer, and is there an easier, better, faster way to answer that question instead of answering data, adding data points. And I think that's valid for us.
Yeah, and it's I think there's a lot of understanding of that, but the language doesn't always reflect that. The like a lot of the comments were, well, what if a member of the public wants a data point? It should be, what if a member of the public wants a dashboard that needs a data point? But they shouldn't, we shouldn't really be asking them what data points do they want. It should be what tools, what dashboards, and there's, I think the governance manual amendment could be improved if the language is changed more to reflect that focus of the work. To provide the best dashboards, tools, visualizations for the public, and less about collecting new data points just for the sake of somebody wants it. But thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? Any comments from committee members for the good of the order? Wonderful. Just so you know, oh, I forgot this part. Marianne, go for it.
I'm happy to. So just a quick process note. I want to start by thanking Kathy, who facilitated the governance manual edits last year at the beginning of the year, and her institutional memory has been phenomenal in helping us do these again this year. Additionally, as we become more institutionalized as an office, we are bringing on additional contract support. So I want to especially thank Sydney, who identified the need for this, and successfully we have a contract with Leading Resources Incorporated, some of whom have been sitting in on this meeting, who will provide more capacity for our office in our support for you as a governing board and supporting the advisory boards, ensuring that we're running meetings effectively and well and according to best practices, and bring a lot of expertise around governance questions like this. So I just wanted to make sure you all know we just started that contract recently. We'll update the full governing board at our next big meeting, but wanted to let you know who they are. We'll be working with them over the next few years, and wanted to make sure you are aware of that. So that was a quick update that we wanted to provide here at the end. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you. No worries. And I think I'd mentioned that we had folks with us today too, earlier in the process. So, all right, marvelous. You can read what you see right there. We will meet again on January 11th to talk about the advisory board selection process. It's a piece that we didn't do today. And then the new data points piece will go out to you, but then we'll talk about that at our January 19th meeting. And that will be, the goal, of course, is for us to finish by the end of January so that we can get it in front of the board at its next meeting. Any questions on that? Okay. And I'd say the slide says it all. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules, especially on a Friday afternoon. And thank you, Kathy, as always, and Marianne and the team. Thank you very much as well. We are adjourned. Have a great weekend.